Officer Sarah drove down the quiet road, her patrol car slicing through the stillness of the early morning. The town I worked in was small and peaceful, surrounded by thick forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly, and crime was rare. I enjoyed these routine patrols, where the only sounds were the rustling trees and the occasional chirping of birds. But today, something unusual caught my eye in the rearview mirror. I noticed movement on the side of the road. At first, I assumed it was just another animal crossing the road, common in an area like this. But as I continued driving, the movement persisted. My gaze sharpened and my breath hitched slightly. A small bear cub was trailing behind my car, struggling to keep up. I slowed down, puzzled by the sight. Cubs usually stayed close to their mothers, avoiding humans at all costs. This one, however, was determined. Its tiny legs moved quickly, trying to match the speed of my vehicle. I pulled over, watching as the cub hesitated before inching closer to my car. Stepping out, I placed a cautious hand on my belt. I had encountered wildlife before, but something about this situation felt different. The cub wasn't behaving like a typical young bear. It didn't seem curious or playful. Its small body trembled, and its dark eyes held something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation. I crouched slightly, trying to assess the animal's condition. It wasn't injured, as far as I could tell. Its fur was a bit dirty, and it looked thinner than it should have been, but nothing suggested immediate danger. What concerned me most was its persistence. Most wild animals, even young ones, would flee at the sight of a human. But this cub stood its ground. The bear took a hesitant step forward, then another. I held my breath as it inched closer. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't making any sudden moves. It simply stared at me, its tiny chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Then, to my shock, it let out a soft whimper. I had spent enough time around animals to recognize distress when I saw it. This cub was not just lost, it needed help. But help with what exactly? I glanced around, scanning the trees and the road behind me. No sign of a mother bear, no sign of any other cubs. The little bear was completely alone. I tried to think through the possibilities. Had it been abandoned? Had the mother been hurt? Or worse? The thought unsettled me. A cub this young wouldn't wander away from its mother unless something had gone terribly wrong. The bear let out another soft cry, breaking my train of thought. Its small body quivered as it stepped even closer, now barely a few feet away. My instincts told me not to move too fast. Though it seemed harmless, it was still a wild animal, and wild animals could be unpredictable. But as I stood there, watching this tiny creature stare up at me with wide eyes, I felt an unfamiliar weight settle in my chest. There was no doubt in my mind now. This cub wasn't just lost. It was looking for something, or someone. I exhaled, placing my hands on my hips. I had no experience handling bear cubs, but I knew I couldn't just leave it here. Something had led it to me. Something had made it follow me. And whatever that something was, it wasn't over yet. I remained still, my eyes locked on the cub that refused to leave my side. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the road, the silence stretching between us. Every logical part of my mind told me to call wildlife services and wait for them to handle the situation. But something about the way the cub looked at me made me hesitate. This wasn't just an ordinary animal encounter. The bear wasn't wandering aimlessly or acting on instinct. It had a purpose. I slowly reached for the radio attached to my shoulder, but before I could press the button, the cub let out another distressed whimper. Its small body trembled as it took another step forward, its paws pressing into the dirt road. There was an urgency in its movements, a silent plea that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't afraid of me. It was trying to tell me something, I exhaled and lowered my hand. My training told me to wait, to let the professionals handle this, but my gut told me something else. I had always trusted my instincts, and right now they were screaming at me to pay attention. I crouched again, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. The cub's ears twitched, but it didn't back away. It simply stared at me, its dark eyes filled with something I had never seen in a wild animal before: desperation. I spoke softly, knowing the cub wouldn't understand my words, but hoping to ease its nerves. Its small body tensed, as if bracing itself for what I might do next. Then, to my complete shock, it stepped forward and reached out a tiny paw, brushing it against my boot. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't normal. Wild animals didn't behave this way. They ran, they hid, they avoided humans at all costs. But this cub had followed me, sought me out, and now it was trying to make contact. My mind raced. Was it tame? Had it been raised by humans? I dismissed the thought almost immediately. The cub was too young to have been separated from its mother for long, and there were no reports of missing or rescued bears in the area. This was something else. I studied its body language carefully. It wasn't just seeking comfort. It wanted something from me. The cub turned suddenly, trotting a few steps toward the tree line before stopping and looking back at me. Its tiny ears perked up, its body still trembling with urgency. I remained frozen in place, watching as it repeated the motion. A few steps forward, then a glance back at me. It was leading me somewhere. My heartbeat quickened. I hesitated, glancing down at my radio again. I should call for backup. I should report this. But the thought of delaying whatever this cub was trying to show me made my stomach twist. I glanced around. The road was empty, the town still sleeping. The trees swayed gently in the wind, the scent of damp earth filling the air. Nothing about the scene looked unusual, yet I felt the weight of something unseen pressing against me. The bear took another step, pausing only when it realized I wasn't following. I made my decision. I straightened, adjusting the belt at my waist, before taking a slow step forward. The cub immediately perked up, its little body tensing in anticipation. It let out a soft noise, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Then, without hesitation, it turned and started moving toward the woods. I followed. I stepped carefully as I followed the cub into the thick undergrowth, my boots pressing against damp leaves and soft earth. The morning light struggled to break through the dense canopy above, casting long shadows that danced between the trees. The cub moved with urgency, trotting ahead a few steps before glancing back to make sure I was still following. Every instinct in my body told me that I was walking into something far bigger than a simple lost animal case. The air smelled of damp moss and pine, a familiar scent in these parts, but there was something else beneath it, something faint, something wrong. My grip tightened around my belt as I moved deeper into the woods. I had seen animals act strangely before, but never like this. The bear wasn't just wandering, it was leading me with purpose. My breathing slowed as I kept pace with the cub. It navigated the rough terrain with ease, its tiny paws pressing into the damp soil without hesitation. I, however, struggled with the uneven ground. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and tangled roots, each step requiring focus. Yet the cub moved forward, as if every second mattered. The further we went, the quieter the world became. The usual rustling of small creatures in the underbrush had faded. No birds called from the branches above. Even the wind had stilled, leaving behind an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I glanced back, realizing just how far I had come from the road. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their trunks forming an impenetrable wall. If I hadn't been following the cub's trail, I might have lost my way already. But there was no turning back now, Then I heard it, a sound so faint it barely reached my ears, but enough to make my heart jolt. A soft, broken whimper. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the cub in front of me. It had come from deeper within the trees. The sound was weak, fragile, almost lost in the stillness of the forest. But it was there, and it wasn't alone. The cub perked up at the sound, its small ears twitching. Without hesitation, it pressed forward, moving faster now, its tiny legs carrying it with renewed urgency. I followed, my pulse quickening. The whimpering grew louder as I moved closer. It was raw, filled with pain and exhaustion. My mind raced through the possibilities, but nothing made sense. Then, just ahead, through the tangled branches and thick undergrowth, I saw it. A shape curled against the base of a fallen tree. My steps slowed, my throat tightening. The cub ran forward, closing the distance between us in seconds. As I drew closer, my stomach twisted at the heartbreaking sight before me. A second cub lay on the ground, barely moving. Its fur was damp and matted with dirt, its tiny body frail and motionless except for the faint rise and fall of its chest. The first cub nudged it desperately, letting out small cries, trying to stir it awake. But the second cub barely responded. I swallowed hard, dropping to one knee beside them. I could see the exhaustion in the second cub's body, the way its sides heaved with each shallow breath. It had been here for a while, alone, weak, barely holding on. My fingers trembled as I reached out, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I had spent my career helping people, but I had never encountered anything like this. The cub had led me here. It had found me, followed me, begged me to come, and now I knew why. I knelt beside the tiny, motionless cub, my heart pounding against my ribs. The first cub whimpered softly, nudging its sibling as if trying to wake it up. But there was barely any response. The little body lay curled against the cold earth, its shallow breaths so faint they were almost undetectable. Its fur was damp and matted, its limbs weak and unmoving. The sight sent a sharp pang through my chest. This cub wasn't just tired, it was on the verge of giving up. The first cub whimpered again, pressing its nose against the smaller one's side. Its tiny paws trembled as it tried to stir its sibling, but the second cub remained still. The desperation in its eyes was unmistakable now. It wasn't just asking for help, it was pleading. I clenched my jaw, a deep unease settling in my stomach. Where was their mother? Bears didn't abandon their young unless something had gone terribly wrong. The thought of a mother bear lying somewhere in the woods, hurt or worse, made my pulse quicken. If these cubs had been alone for too long, the weaker one might not last much longer. I forced myself to think logically. I needed to act fast, but I also needed to be smart. My hand reached for the radio at my shoulder, my fingers curling around the cool metal. I could call for backup, a wildlife team, someone who actually knew how to handle the situation. But the moment I lifted the radio to my mouth, I hesitated. Something about this moment felt different. This wasn't a routine wildlife sighting. The first cub had gone out of its way to find me. It had followed me, chosen me, and now it was looking at me like I was its last hope. My chest tightened as I exhaled slowly. I wasn't a veterinarian. I wasn't a wildlife expert. I was just a small-town officer on my morning patrol. But, in this moment, none of that mattered. I reached forward cautiously, brushing my fingertips against the smaller cub's fur. It was colder than it should have been. The tiny body barely stirred at my touch. The first cub whimpered louder now, its distress growing. Without thinking, I removed my jacket, spreading it out on the forest floor. Carefully, I scooped up the frail cub, cradling it in my arms. The first cub let out a distressed cry, its small paws tapping against my leg. But I hushed it softly, murmuring gentle reassurances, even though I knew the cub couldn't understand my words. The weak cub barely reacted as I wrapped it in my jacket. Its breathing was slow and uneven. It had lost too much warmth, too much strength. The realization made me move faster. If I didn't act quickly, I wasn't sure how much longer it would last. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how deep I had gone into the woods. The trees stretched endlessly in all directions, their towering trunks blending together in the dim morning light. The sun was higher now, but beneath the thick canopy, the world still felt shadowed and cold. I had walked farther than I realized, and now I had to get back, with both cubs in tow. The first cub pressed itself against my side, still shaking. Its wide eyes stayed locked on its sibling, unwilling to leave its side. I adjusted my hold on the tiny, wrapped-up cub and took a slow, steady breath. I had no choice. I had to get them out of here. I rose to my feet, the weight of responsibility pressing against my shoulders. The first cub immediately followed, trotting after me without hesitation. It wasn't looking around anymore. It wasn't searching. It trusted me completely now. I didn't stop to question it. I didn't have time. With one last glance at the darkened forest around me, I turned and began the long journey back. I moved as quickly as I could through the dense forest, cradling the weak cub in my arms, while the first cub stayed close to my side. The weight of the tiny creature was barely noticeable, but the weight of the moment pressed down on me like a heavy burden I had never carried before. I had never carried something so fragile, never been responsible for a life so small yet so significant. Every step felt like a race against time. The cub wrapped in my jacket remained unnervingly still, its frail body barely shifting with each breath. The other cub whimpered softly, its tiny paws crunching against the forest floor as it trotted beside me. It no longer hesitated or looked back. It had made its choice. It was staying with me. My boots pressed into the damp earth as I maneuvered over fallen branches and uneven ground. The trees loomed high above, their thick canopies blocking out much of the morning light. The further I walked, the more aware I became of how isolated we were. If something went wrong out here, if I tripped or lost my way, there would be no one to help. My radio was still clipped to my shoulder, but I resisted the urge to call for backup. Every second I spent waiting for someone to arrive was a second the weaker cub might not have. I had to get them back to my car. Then I could call in the right people. But first, I needed to get out of these trees. The first cub whimpered again, its little body brushing against my leg, as if seeking reassurance. I glanced down and gave a small nod, even though I knew it wouldn't understand. I didn't have the words to comfort it. Not that words would have helped. The only thing that mattered now was moving forward. My legs ached as I pressed on, the weight of the cub in my arms growing heavier with each passing minute. I shifted my grip slightly, adjusting the way the jacket wrapped around its fragile frame. The bundle of fur was still warm, but its movements were minimal. That wasn't a good sign. My heart pounded as I quickened my pace. The edge of the woods had to be close. I had been walking for what felt like forever, but the trees still stretched endlessly around me. The silence pressed in, broken only by the soft sounds of my own breathing and the steady rustling of the cub at my feet. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a break in the trees. Sunlight spilled through the gaps, illuminating a familiar stretch of dirt road. Relief surged through my chest as I pushed forward, my feet moving faster. The first cub kept pace, its energy renewed now that we were almost out. As I reached the clearing, I spotted my patrol car exactly where I had left it. The sight of it made my stomach unclench slightly, but there was no time to slow down. I hurried to the vehicle, yanking open the door with one hand while carefully lowering the wrapped cub onto the passenger seat. The first cub jumped up, scrambling inside as if afraid to be left behind. I grabbed my radio, my voice steady but urgent, and reported the situation as quickly as I could, giving my location and requesting immediate assistance from wildlife rescue. I didn't know how much time the smaller cub had left, but I wasn't taking any chances. I turned back to the tiny creature on my seat. Its breaths were still too shallow, its body too weak. But it was here now, out of the forest, no longer alone. The first cub curled up beside it, resting its head against its sibling's side. I watched them for a moment, my chest tightening at the sight. It had done everything it could to save its sibling. It had fought to find help, refused to give up. Now it was my turn to do the same. I sat behind the wheel, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on my chest as I glanced at the two cubs on the passenger seat. The first cub remained curled beside its sibling, its small body pressed close as if trying to share its warmth. The weaker cub lay motionless, wrapped securely in my jacket, its shallow breaths barely visible. I took a steady breath and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, breaking the uneasy silence that had settled inside the car. I didn't waste another second. The tires kicked up dust as I pulled onto the road, my gaze flicking between the empty stretch ahead and the fragile creature beside me. My radio crackled as dispatch responded to my earlier call, confirming that a wildlife rescue team was being sent to my location. But I didn't have time to wait for them to reach me. The rescue center was on the outskirts of town, about a 15-minute drive away. I could get there faster than any team dispatched to the scene. I pressed down on the gas pedal, forcing myself to stay focused. The road was quiet, the forest on either side of me blurring past. I had driven these back roads 100 times before, but never had a drive felt this long. Every passing second felt like a countdown I couldn't control. The first cub let out a soft whimper, shifting its tiny frame to nudge its sibling. I glanced over briefly, my chest tightening at the sight. It was worried. It could sense that something was wrong. I tightened my grip on the wheel and pushed forward. The rescue center wasn't far. If I could just make it there in time, if they could just hold on a little longer, there was still hope. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting golden light across the landscape. The town came into view in the distance, but I barely registered the familiar buildings as I sped past. The only thing that mattered was getting to that rescue center. My radio crackled again, the voice of another officer coming through. They had received my report and were offering to send additional support. I barely responded, muttering a quick acknowledgement before flipping the siren on. The wailing sound broke the morning calm as I raced through the quiet streets. Finally, up ahead, I spotted the Wildlife Rescue Center, a modest building surrounded by open land, with enclosures and rehabilitation areas stretching behind it. I had been here before, responding to occasional calls about injured animals found near the roads, but never like this. I pulled into the gravel lot, tires skidding slightly as I threw the car into park. Before I could even reach for the door handle, 2 rescue workers were already rushing out, alerted by my siren. I wasted no time. I scooped up the wrapped cub and stepped out of the vehicle, moving quickly toward them. The first cub scrambled after me, refusing to be left behind. "They're in bad shape," I said, my voice tight. "The little one barely has any strength left." The workers nodded immediately, taking the fragile cub from my arms. One of them unwrapped part of the jacket, checking the cub's condition, while the other turned toward the first cub, who hesitated, but didn't run. I exhaled, watching as the professionals took over. The weaker cub was carried inside, disappearing behind the center's doors. The first cub lingered at the threshold, its tiny frame frozen with uncertainty. I crouched beside it, placing a steady hand near the ground. "They're going to help," I murmured, unsure if the cub could understand my voice, but hoping it could at least feel the reassurance. The cub hesitated for a moment longer. Then, with one last glance at me, it stepped forward and followed them inside. I remained outside for a moment, staring at the door that had closed behind them. I had done everything I could. Now, all I could do was wait. I paced outside the rescue center, my boots crunching against the gravel as I glanced at the door every few seconds. The morning air had warmed, but I barely noticed. My mind was locked on the fragile cub now in the hands of the wildlife experts. I had done my part, but an uneasy feeling sat deep in my stomach. Would it be enough? The first cub had disappeared inside with the workers without hesitation, as if it knew this was where they needed to be. That thought alone made me swallow the lump in my throat. The little one had never given up. It had fought to find help, had done everything in its tiny power to make sure its sibling wasn't left alone. I took a deep breath and leaned against my patrol car. My shift had technically ended, but I wasn't leaving, not yet. I needed to know if the cub would pull through. Minutes stretched into an hour. The doors remained closed, and no one came out. My fingers tapped anxiously against my belt, a habit I had developed on long stakeouts. I tried to push down the uncertainty, to remind myself that this was in the hands of people who knew what they were doing. But patience had never been my strength, and right now every second felt like a lifetime. Then, finally, the door swung open. One of the rescue workers stepped outside, wiping their hands on their uniform before making their way toward me. I straightened immediately, searching their face for any sign of news. "It was close," the worker said, their voice carrying a weight of relief. "But the little one is stable, for now. Severely dehydrated and malnourished, but we've got fluids in, and it's responding. It's going to take time, but we think it has a chance." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. A mix of relief and exhaustion hit me all at once. I had spent my career responding to emergencies, saving people in desperate situations, but today had felt different. More personal, more fragile. "And the first cub?" I asked, glancing toward the door as if expecting to see it appear. The worker smiled slightly. "Hasn't left its sibling's side. It's been watching over it the entire time, like a little guardian. Whatever bond they have, it's strong." My chest tightened. That tiny cub had fought so hard, had refused to leave its sibling behind, had trusted me with something so precious. And now, after everything, it had finally found the help it had been searching for. I nodded, rubbing a hand across my face before glancing back toward the center. "Can I see them?" The worker hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Come on in." I followed them inside. The air was cooler, the scent of antiseptic and fresh hay filling the space. Soft sounds of other recovering animals drifted through the building, but my eyes immediately locked onto the enclosure at the far end of the room. Inside, the first cub sat curled protectively beside its sibling, its small body pressed close, offering warmth and comfort. The weaker cub was bundled in soft blankets, an IV drip running beside it. Its breathing was still shallow, but steadier now, stronger. I exhaled slowly as I stepped closer. The first cub lifted its head at my approach, those dark eyes meeting mine once again. For the first time since this started, there was no desperation in its gaze, no panic, no pleading, just trust. I crouched beside the enclosure, resting my arms on the edge. "You did good," I murmured, my voice softer than I expected. The cub blinked slowly, then nestled closer to its sibling. I stayed there for a long time, watching as the tiny, fragile life I had feared wouldn't make it now had a second chance. Days passed, and I found myself returning to the rescue center more often than I had planned. Each time I told myself I was just checking in, making sure the cubs were adjusting. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The moment I had locked eyes with that tiny bear in the woods, something had shifted inside me. I had spent years working as an officer, responding to distress calls, helping people in moments of crisis. But this felt different. The first cub had stayed by its sibling's side every day. The bond between them was undeniable. Even as the weaker cub slowly regained its strength, the other refused to stray too far, always curled up beside it, watching over it like a tiny guardian. The rescue workers marveled at the connection, calling it one of the strongest displays of loyalty they had ever seen. I wasn't surprised. I had witnessed it firsthand. The once fragile cub was stronger now. It no longer struggled to lift its head or breathe properly. It had started to eat, small bites at first, but enough to keep going. I had worried at first that it wouldn't make it through those first crucial days, but the cub had fought, just like its sibling had fought to find me. One afternoon, as I stepped into the rescue center again, one of the workers greeted me with a knowing smile. "They're asking for you," they said, nodding toward the enclosure. My eyebrows lifted slightly, but I didn't question it. I made my way inside, stepping toward the familiar space at the end of the room. The first cub was already waiting for me, ears perked up, eyes watching me intently as I approached. It lifted itself onto its small paws, pressing closer to the edge. I crouched down, resting my arms on the barrier. "Hey there," I murmured. The cub didn't hesitate. It moved forward, pressing its nose against the space between the bars. A soft, familiar sound escaped its throat. It wasn't a cry of distress. It was something gentler, a recognition. I exhaled slowly, my lips curving into a small smile. I reached out, letting my fingers hover just close enough for the cub to sniff them. "You did good," I whispered. "You saved your sibling." The second cub, still weaker than its companion but no longer fragile, lifted its head slightly from the blankets. It blinked sleepily, shifting in its nest of warmth. It was recovering slowly but surely. The rescue workers had already made plans for the cubs once they were strong enough. They would be moved to a larger rehabilitation facility, where they would be raised with other rescued cubs, away from human influence, preparing them for a future back in the wild. I knew it was the right thing, the best thing, but still, a part of me felt something tighten in my chest at the thought of saying goodbye. I remained there for a while, watching as the first cub eventually curled back up beside its sibling, its tiny body a shield of warmth and protection. It trusted me, but it belonged in the wild. It had always belonged there. As I finally stood, stepping back from the enclosure, I let out a slow breath. The cub had found me that morning on the road for a reason. It had led me through the trees, shown me something I never could have found on my own. It had placed all its trust in my hands, and now I had done everything I could. One of the rescue workers joined me as I stepped away, watching the cubs with quiet admiration. "You know," they said, "I don't think I've ever seen a case like this before. That little one, it wasn't just looking for help. It knew exactly what it was doing." I nodded, my gaze lingering on the cub one last time. "Yeah," I murmured. "I think so too." I stepped outside into the warm afternoon light, inhaling deeply as I felt the weight of the past few days finally settle. The cub had found me for a reason, and now it was exactly where it needed to be. As I climbed into my patrol car and pulled onto the road, I took one last glance in the rearview mirror at the rescue center disappearing behind me. Then, with a small smile, I focused on the road ahead. Because some stories, no matter how unexpected, always find their way to the right ending.